The shovels struck the packed soil under a crescent moon, their rhythm harsh against the stillness of the countryside. Seth wiped his brow and glanced at Ron, who grunted as he drove his spade deeper. A third man, Will, stood guard, eyes darting nervously between the ancient oaks surrounding the cemetery. The rumors of Arlena Winters, the witches of Black Veil, had lured them here, but whispers of her curse gave even Will pause. "Keep digging," Ron snapped, his voice cutting through the nocturnal quiet. "Gold doesn't find itself." "She wasn't buried with gold," Seth muttered. "They said it was artifacts, relics, the kind that collectors pay for." "That's enough for me," Ron said, his broad shoulders heaving as he tossed another mound of earth aside. "Superstitions don't pay bills." The night felt alive, too alive. Crickets chirped erratically and owls hooted from somewhere unseen, but it was the way the wind hissed through the trees, low and accusatory, that unnerved Seth. Finally, their shovels struck wood. The coffin was old, its wood pale and cracked with age. The carvings on the lid, a series of swirling eldritch symbols, seemed almost to shimmer in the moonlight. "Is that writing?" Seth asked, unease bleeding into his voice. "Shut it!" Ron barked, though even he hesitated as he ran his fingers over the strange etchings. "It's nothing." The three men pried open the lid, revealing the mummified remains of Arlena Winters. Her skull bore remnants of dried flesh, and her hands were clasped over a heavy, ornate book bound in black leather. Around her neck hung a pendant of twisted silver, its design as alien and unknowable as the symbols on the coffin. "This book?" Will whispered. "We should leave it." Ron's laughter was sharp and derisive. "This is what we came for." He reached down and wrenched the book free from the corpse's grip. The moment it left her hands, the wind died. The crickets fell silent. The forest held its breath. The men exchanged uneasy glances, but Ron shoved the book into his pack and muttered, "Let's go." Day 1. The whispering begins. By morning, Seth regretted his part in the grave robbery. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at his untouched coffee. The night had been restless. Whispers had crept through the cracks of his house, voices just beyond comprehension. He had dismissed it as guilt, a trick of the mind, until he noticed the scratches on his bedroom door. Deep, jagged grooves that hadn't been there before. He called Ron, but the line crackled with static, and all he could hear was faint breathing. "Ron?" Seth asked, his voice trembling. "Is that you?" A low growl answered, followed by a shriek so piercing that he dropped the phone. When he tried calling again, the line was dead. Day 2. Shadows in the corners. That evening, Seth's unease grew into terror. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, creeping along the edges of his vision. Every light in his house seemed dimmer, as if the darkness were bleeding in. He bolted his doors and windows, but it didn't matter. The whispers returned, louder now, echoing through the halls and carrying his name. Seth, Seth. In desperation, he called Will, but Will was in worse shape. "They're in my house," Will whispered, his voice hoarse. "They're watching me." "What's watching you?" Seth demanded. The shadows," Will choked out. They're alive, and they don't like us." Day 3. The haunting intensifies. Ron hadn't answered his phone in 2 days. Seth and Will met at Ron's house, desperate for answers. The place was in shambles, Furniture was overturned, mirrors were shattered, and symbols, identical to the ones on the coffin, were scrawled across the walls in what looked like blood. They found Ron in the basement, sitting in the corner, clutching the book to his chest. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, his lips moving soundlessly. "Ron!" Seth shouted, shaking him. Ron turned to them, his face gaunt and unrecognizable. "We shouldn't have touched it." "She's coming." "Who's coming?" Will asked, his voice barely audible. "She wants it back," Ron rasped. "The book, the pendant, all of it." Without warning, Ron's head snapped back and his body convulsed violently. His mouth opened in a scream, but no sound came out. Then, with a sickening crack, he slumped forward, lifeless. The book fell from his hands, landing with an audible thud. The room seemed to shudder, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. Day 4, the final descent. Seth and Will tried to destroy the book, but it wouldn't burn, tear, or even stain. The pendant, which Will had pocketed during the robbery, grew impossibly cold, searing his skin like frostbite. "We have to take it back," Seth said, his voice trembling. "We have to put it all back." But the spirits had no intention of letting them go. As they drove toward the cemetery, the car's headlights flickered, and a figure appeared in the middle of the road, tall, cloaked, and unmistakably inhuman. The car swerved, crashing into a ditch. When Seth regained consciousness, Will was gone. The book lay beside him, its pages fluttering in the wind despite the still air. The symbols within seemed to writhe, their meaning pressing into his mind like nails into flesh. A voice echoed in his head, cold and commanding. "Return what you have taken, or suffer." Day 5, the reckoning. Seth stumbled back to the cemetery, alone, clutching the book and pendant. The grave of Arlena Winters was undisturbed, as though they had never dug it up. He dropped to his knees and began digging with his hands, desperate to undo what they had done. As he placed the book and pendant back into the coffin, a figure emerged from the shadows, a woman with hollow eyes and an ethereal presence. Her face was a rotted mask of malice. "You took what was mine," she hissed, her voice reverberating with unnatural power, "and now you belong to me." Seth tried to scream, but his voice was stolen. The shadows closed in, wrapping around him like a shroud. His last thought was of the whispers, now a cacophony of mocking laughter. By dawn, the graveyard was silent again. The grave of Arlena Winters lay untouched, and Seth was nowhere to be found.